Sometime in the early 1940s, a young, starving and broke aspiring writer drunkenly wandered into the downtown LA public library in search of something to read. The library had become somewhat of a refuge for the young man. It was a place to hide from his landlady when he couldn't afford that month's rent, a place that had shelter and working toilet facilities open to all, and a place where the lack of wine to drink and pangs of an empty stomach could be blotted out by the reliable escapism of books. Skimming over the endless rows of books, the young man searched helplessly as he attempted to find something that could provide this escapism, something that had some substance, something to kill another evening. Yet it was all in vain, as he had exhausted his options weeks ago. Long before, the young man had tried the books in the religion section, he had dipped his toe into some philosophy, and he had even attempted to get his head around advanced mathematics, but like everything else, it never stuck. Finally, in a desperate act of spontaneity, the young man pulled out a foreign book atop a shelf lingering above. Bringing it down to his level, he opened the first page and began to read, and with his curiosity piqued, he turned over to the next page, and then the next and the next, until, before he was conscious of it, he was checking the book out of the library, walking back to his flat, getting into bed and reading the book in its entirety in one sitting. Many years following this finding, the young man would fulfill his aspiration of becoming a respected writer, achieving the incredibly unlikely outcome of fame with literature, and would forever attribute this chance find in the downtown LA public library to pushing him on to do so. The writer in question was Charles Bukowski, and the book he found that day in the downtown LA public library was Ask the Dust by John Fante. Many people watching this video will likely be familiar with professional poet, novelist and drunk Charles Bukowski. Bukowski is best known for his semi-autobiographical novel Post Office, but is also known for his many other novels, short stories and collections of poetry, all of which continued the fame and success he achieved upon the publication of Post Office in the early 1970s. When Bukowski reached his goal of becoming recognised as a writer, he had done so at the age of 50 and with a long history of poverty, setbacks, near-death experiences and frequent rejection letters behind him. As would be expected from such a turbulent life, something would have to be there to keep a man stable, to keep him from going over the edge, and for Bukowski, that something was the novels of John Fante. Fante had often written about the down-and-out life in a style reminiscent of Bukowski's own direct and confrontational way of writing, and when Bukowski stumbled across his work as a young man, he had felt as if he had found relatable novels of substance and true emotion, two elements that so many modern writers supposedly lacked. However, despite Bukowski's own feelings towards Fante, the world did not share his enthusiasm, or at least were not able to, as Fante's books had fallen out of print and remained so for decades. Knowing this, and having a platform in which to do so, Bukowski set about making sure the world knew of John Fante, which eventually led to the two becoming friends. However, by this time in Fante's life, he had suffered a personal tragedy that left him legless and blind, unable to even see the man who gave his catalogue of work a second life. So, who is John Fante? Well, that's what this video is for, but in summary, I would say John Fante was a great writer who was the victim of an unfortunate series of circumstances, a man whose spirits belonged to the poverty-stricken gutter in which he'd been born. No matter what good fortune, however small, happened to come his way, life had developed a dark habit of destabilising the balance of good and bad, always choosing to outweigh the former with the latter. Yet, regardless of this misfortune, Fante still managed to immortalise himself in his writing, and produce a body of work so impressive it holds up today as people continue to discover him long after his death. And of course, Fante had inspired one of the most famous writers of the 20th century, Charles Bukowski, who, with all the adulation and praise being heaped upon him after the publication of Post Office, never shied away from owing it all to Fante, the man he would claim saved his life, the man he revered more than anything, and the man Bukowski would publicly declare as his god. John Fante was born on April 8, 1909, in Denver, Colorado, to Italian immigrant parents. His mother was Mary Fante and his father was Nicola Fante. Fante's father was a bricklayer and stonemason who drank excessively and who would often gamble the family's money away, leaving Fante alongside his mother and siblings to go without money regularly. As a child, Fante bounced around schools in Boulder, Colorado, and as a young man in the late 1920s, he attended the University of Colorado, but soon dropped out to focus on his writing. Around this time, Fante's father left his mother, and so Fante, his mother and his siblings moved to Southern California, where Fante worked to support the family. Eventually, Fante's father returned to his mother, and the entire family moved back up north, with Fante choosing to move to Long Beach, where he attended a junior college until his money ran out. After running out of money, Fante moved to downtown LA in the early 1930s, living in a hotel located on Bunker Hill, an area that would inspire him massively. It was here where his writing career began. During this time, Fante struck up a friendship through correspondence with H.L. Mencken, who was the editor of the American Mercury. Fante would have his first story published by Mencken titled Altar Boy in the magazine, and many more during the mid-1930s. Mencken would also act as a mentor to Fante, giving him advice on writing and getting him in contact with publishers, one of which gave him a $500 advance to write his first novel. The novel was completed in 1936 and given the name The Road to Los Angeles, yet was rejected. 2 years later, however, Fante would write another novel and succeed in getting it published. The novel was titled Wait Until Spring, Bandini. In the time Wait Until Spring, Bandini was written, Fante would get married to Joyce Fante, a woman who would remain as a pillar of strength throughout his life. Wait Until Spring, Bandini would be Fante's first public showing of his alter ego, Arturo Bandini, and the book was received well enough in fact, that Fante was given the go-ahead to write another novel, culminating in his 1939 masterpiece, Ask the Dust. Like Wait Until Spring, Bandini, Ask the Dust features Arturo Bandini, and the story itself is largely based on Fante's own experiences. In the book, Bandini lives in downtown LA at the Alta Loma Hotel on Bunker Hill, where he is attempting to become a writer. The character of Bandini could be described as arrogant, self-obsessed, and acutely aware of his own writing ability, which is further encouraged by a man called J.C. Hackmuth, the editor of The Atlantic, who published Bandini's short story, The Little Dog Laughed, in the magazine. One day, Bandini wanders into a bar called the Columbia Cafe, where he meets Camila Lopez, a woman he falls in love with, and with whom he begins a dysfunctional relationship. Bandini and Lopez both bond on their shared experiences of prejudice against them due to their heritage. However, it is also a stick that the two use to beat each other with during their fiery arguments. Eventually, Bandini finds out that Lopez is in love with the bartender at the Columbia Cafe, a guy called Sammy, and his purpose becomes turning that love towards him. Bandini thus goes looking for Lopez at Sammy's house, which is located in the desert. However, Sammy had thrown her out, and she wandered off before Bandini's arrival. And knowing he won't find her, he throws the newly published book of his in the direction of which she disappeared. When Ask the Dust was published in 1939, the book sold poorly, received mixed reviews, and fell out of print before the beginning of the new decade. Fante's bad luck was largely to blame for the failure of the book, as the timing of the publication was largely attributable to why the book was forgotten. Firstly, the book was a little too ahead of its time for most people, resulting in mixed reviews. Secondly, John Steinbeck's novel The Grapes of Wrath was published in the same year and was a hugely successful novel, and also it filled up the space for books on Depression-era America. And thirdly, legal complications between Fante's publishers and Houghton Mifflin, who were both publishing translated versions of Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf, pushed Ask the Dust to the bottom of the priorities list. Besides the publication of a short story collection titled Dago Red the following year, Fante had decided to stop writing books in order to fully dedicate himself to writing screenplays in Hollywood, as the money was more reliable, but unfortunately, the work was more creatively restricting. Fante wrote to Mencken for advice on this change, to which Mencken responded, "Get something from the movie magnates in order to finance the work you want to do." And so that's half of what Fante did. He did wind up making a decent living from screenwriting, and at one point even collaborated with Orson Welles, but he rarely worked on the work he wanted to do, besides the 1952 book later turned into a movie called Full of Life, and much later Brothers of the Grape, released in 1977. Over the years, Fante would grow more and more frustrated with the creative limitations that come with screenwriting, as well as the time it would take away from writing novels. And then in 1955, Fante was diagnosed with diabetes. Fante continued with his work into the late 1970s, when his condition took a drastic turn for the worse. By May 26, 1977, Fante had a toe on each foot amputated. On June 25th, Fante had his left leg amputated just below the knee. On August 3rd, the rest of his left leg was amputated. And just when things couldn't get worse, the following year, in June, Fante had gone blind. By mid-1978, John Fante was blind and had one leg, with the other showing signs of maybe having to be taken too. He was completely reliant on his wife Joyce, and his life's purpose of becoming a known and respected writer seemed to be all but over. He had seemingly been completely forgotten. Fante appeared to be on the edge of death by this time, never knowing the impact his work would have on those few fortunate people who would happen to stumble across it like Bukowski did, until December 12, 1978, when a man by the name of Ben Pleasance arrived at the house of John and Joyce Fante, asking politely to interview the writer who wrote Ask the Dust. The two invited Pleasance in, unaware of the significant turn of luck this man was set in motion during that very interview. In 1971, when Charles Bukowski reached the age of 50 years old, the publication of his first novel was undertaken by Black Sparrow Press, owned by John Martin, and was given the title Post Office. Post Office is a semi-autobiographical retelling of Bukowski's down-and-out lifestyle in the 1950s and 60s, whilst working as a postal carrier and later a letter filing clerk in his local post office. The book features the debut of Bukowski's bandy-esque alter ego, Henry Chinaski, who, like Fante's Arturo Bandini, would regularly return to Bukowski's work to blur the line between reality and fiction. Bukowski's life had changed practically overnight upon the release of this book. He had gone from a man hopping between dead-end jobs, whilst bordering on the edge of abject poverty, to a literary phenomenon and symbol of the down-and-outs. With this newfound fame, Bukowski would spend the next few years publishing more books, and giving live poetry readings to drunken rowdy crowds, all pining to see the mythical-like persona Bukowski had built for himself. As would be expected, Bukowski's name continued to rise, and with this growing appreciation in the literary world, bordering on into the mainstream, came the usual barrage of requests for opportunities and interviews. One such request for an interview happened to be from Ben Pleasance. Bukowski would eventually come to see Pleasance as a friend, and Bukowski would suggest Pleasance read Fante's Ask the Dust. After reading it, Pleasance knew he had to try and get the book back in print, but before travelling to Fante's house for permission to do so, he asked Bukowski if he would be willing to write a preface to the reprinting of Ask the Dust. Bukowski unsurprisingly agreed, and thus, on that day on December 12, 1978, Pleasance would pitch the idea to Fante, who didn't know who Bukowski was, yet agreed to the idea with an unenthusiastic answer characteristic of his often suspicious nature. That's fine. And thus, the wheels were set in motion. Pleasance's original plan was to give Ask the Dust to the owner of City Lights publication, Lawrence Ferlinghetti. He would then ask him to read it and consider republishing it with an introduction from Bukowski. Coincidentally, around this time, Bukowski had given Ask the Dust to his own publisher, John Martin, after Martin asked Bukowski about a random excerpt in his 1978 book Women, in which Fante's name is brought up. Subsequently, Martin read the book, loved it, and took up the job of getting Ask the Dust back in print. Bukowski would thus write his introduction on May 6, 1979. When it was sent to Fante, Fante was back in the hospital due to an infected ulcer on his right foot. Fante was understandably low, as this ulcer marked the beginning of him losing his right leg, which was eventually amputated below the knee on July 31st the following year. Yet when Joyce read Bukowski's 2-page long declaration of reverence to Fante, his hopeless situation seemed hopeful. The introduction describes the story of Bukowski discovering Ask the Dust in the downtown LA public library in his 20s, and Bukowski expands on the impact Fante had had on his work and life. Yes, Fante had a mighty effect upon me. Not long after reading these books, I began living with a woman. She was a worse drunk than I was, and we had some violent arguments, and often I would scream at her, "Don't call me a son of a bitch, I am Bandini. Arturo Bandini." Bukowski would also give Fante the ultimate compliment just below these lines. "Fante was my god, and I knew that the gods should be left alone. One didn't bang at their door, yet I liked to guess about where he had lived on Angel's Flight, and I imagined it possible that he still lived there. Almost every day I walked by and I thought, is that the window Camilla crawled through? And is that the hotel door? Is that the lobby? I never knew." Finally, at the beginning of the new decade, Ask the Dust was republished by Black Sparrow Press in January of 1980. The introduction provided by Bukowski helped boost sales rapidly. During the process of getting the book republished, Bukowski, who had always been reluctant to disturb Fante, had now had an opportunity to meet him, which he did in the spring of 1979, whilst Fante was still in the hospital. The two would thus become friends, and once out of the hospital, Fante would often invite Bukowski and his wife over to his and Joyce's house for dinner. Bukowski described one of these interactions as such. "Yeah, we went down there once and he'd been out of the hospital, and they propped him up at the table, you know, and he said, 'Well, I'm not allowed to drink, but I'm gonna have a glass of wine with you, Hank.' I said, 'Thank you, John.' Then we sat a while, we were talking, and suddenly he got tired. He said, 'I have to go to bed.' I put him back in his bed, and then we were all sitting there talking, getting drunk. That poor guy was back in his bedroom, though we were talking about him, a lot of it. Then he let out this mournful howl. It was horrible." During this time, Bukowski would also send Fante several of his own books, as well as a recording of one of his poetry readings in Germany. Bukowski would also one day write to Fante for advice on the creative restrictions he was facing whilst writing the screenplay for the film Barfly. "Your French director who stands over your shoulder, measuring the screenplay at 1 minute per page, sounds like a kook to me. It seems to me that subject matter determines style and time. Maybe you might want to break some rules. You need limitless horizons and distances. You cannot be bound by the Frenchman's rules. You are the writer, so write a unique and unorthodox screenplay." Between hospital visits and meetups with Bukowski, Fante had also begun working on what was to be his final novel in early September 1979. Due to being unable to write himself, he dictated the entire book to Joyce, and by December 7th, the manuscript was typed up. When Joyce read the final chapter of the new book to Bukowski over the phone, Bukowski claimed that listening to it pulled him out of an impotent period in his writing. Black Sparrow Press published Fante's final novel in 1982. It once again featured Fante's alter ego Arturo Bandini, and was given the title Dreams from Bunker Hill. The following year, Black Sparrow Press republished Fante's first novel, Wait Until Spring Bandini. But unfortunately for Fante, his health had taken yet another turn for the worse, and he was once again back in the hospital. This time, however, he would never return home. John Fante died on May 8, 1983, at the age of 74. On the 11th of May, friends and family gathered to celebrate the life of one of America's most forgotten writers, at Our Lady of Malibu Church in California. It is said that on the day of the funeral, Bukowski sat apart from both friends and family, grieving the loss of his god in private, in a creased brown sports coat. Bukowski would go on to live until March 9, 1994, dying at the age of 73 from leukemia. In the interval between Fante's death and his own, Bukowski would commemorate Fante often in both interviews and his work. Some of the pieces in which Fante is mentioned include The Passing of a Great One, Suggestion for an Arrangement, Result, The Wine of Forever, and simply, Fante. Around this time, in 1985 to be exact, Black Sparrow Press would publish the final piece to the Bandini Quartet when Joyce discovered the lost manuscript for The Road to Los Angeles. The relationship between Fante and Bukowski is a strange one, and you really couldn't have one without the other. Bukowski would likely never have developed his style without the writings of Fante, yet Fante never would have found the audience without Bukowski. When looking back on Bukowski's work, the influence of Fante is readily apparent. Like Fante, Bukowski's novels were more or less retellings of his own experiences through the lens of his alter ego Henry Chinaski. He appears in Post Office, Factotum, Women, Hammond Rye, and lastly, Hollywood. When ordered chronologically to Chinaski's life, we practically read the life of Bukowski, but just with embellishments here or there. And similarly, when you order the Bandini Quartet, you get the same result. The place where these two writers' similarities end is in their recognition. Despite Bukowski's efforts, Fante had still gone largely unrecognised during his life, and whilst Bukowski's name has continued to grow following his death, Fante's has too, yet usually due to his being the main inspiration of Bukowski. Yet, the tide is slowly beginning to turn for Fante, and it even seems as if his name has slowly seeped its way into the mainstream. So much so, in fact, that in 2010, a whole square was dedicated to him. In 2009, the host of an annual tour dedicated to Fante, Richard Shave, petitioned to have John Fante honoured with a square in Los Angeles. The petition had gained some traction, and subsequently, after many discussions, the proposal was put to a vote, which was approved. Thus, on April 8, 2010, on Fante's 101st birthday, a crowd that included Fante's family, friends, and fellow writers gathered at the intersection of 5th and Grand to display a sign that designated that area as John Fante Square. In the square, located in none other than downtown Los Angeles, contains the notorious Bunker Hill, the place Fante wrote about countless times in his novels, as well as the downtown public library, the building Fante entered time and time again in the 1930s while struggling to fulfill his dream and make it as a writer, and the building Bukowski would discover asked the dust many years later whilst harbouring the same dream.